No. In foreign policy, he can do everyone know we're repeating the Twitter questions. So I'm sitting.
Process, not the exact question.
Yeah. So I'll be sitting over here and I'll hand to perfect.
Hi, I'm Lauren McDonough from the American Academy.
Oh, hi.
So I just
Oh,
wanted
great.
to say
Hi.
hi.
That's the sponsor of the whole thing, right?
Hi. Nice to meet you. Hi, Helen.
Hi, I'm Brandice.
Hi. See you.
Oh, I think we're all of you guessing.
Yeah. Thank you for doing that. Appreciate it. I'll come after there's a reception at Prospect House.
Oh, I think I forgot all about that. Are you guys going to the reception? I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it, but... Are you going to the reception? I forgot that there was a reception.
It's afterwards at hospital.
Okay. Oh, okay. Which I...
It's just for the
Okay, no, yeah.
that's why there's so many it's very distinguished audiences.
Brandice, you were pessimistic about the election.
What do you mean about the outcome? I never thought she'd get away. So, yeah, the Helen was the most.
Oh, you were the most. Okay. No, I thought in the middle of the summer, I thought she'd win a landslide, but by the end, I was, by the like 2-3 weeks out, I was very worried.
Well, the media gives you people, like, I know this isn't our topic, but the media really didn't. I mean, so I think people, if you didn't know how to interpret it yourself, then you know how to interpret it.
Like if you were a neuroscientist?
Yes, yes. You can't say that. Eating bugs. Yes. If you're, then you wouldn't.
It's funny, I knew Nate Silver in high school, and I kind of just always felt like he was saying was persuasive.
Yeah, no.
Having so many undecided voters by the end, and like,
People were angry. I know. That when he said it's only, you guys, people were really angry.
yeah.
He was intentionally, but why would he intentionally?
Well, I think they had these malicious, this sort of like malign motives that he was trying to cover his ass after not predicting the primaries.
Yeah, but it was sort of,
People had all sorts of like really nasty motives that like now that he works for ABC, he's trying to add drama.
and then some people were being
I know.
he was wrong. It's like, no.
He was the, he was,
You have to do it 3 times,
yeah.
or more like even below.
I'm sorry, 1 in 3 times is a coin toss. And it was a coin toss in the end. The electoral vote was a coin. I mean, well, it wasn't.
It's tricky.
It's hard to know. Only a small number.
5,000.
Yeah, in the upper Midwest. Yeah.
That went across the numbers. It's weird.
Yep.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event, which we've entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? Policy Priorities for the Trump Administration. As you might suspect, the second part of that title is relatively new. When we planned this panel back in the summer, I think many of us may well have expected that we would be talking about a different set of policy challenges and issues. But nevertheless, we're delighted to be able to bring to you our analysis of how the new administration is going to perform going forward. Last Thursday, as many of you may have attended, a section in which we discussed the election itself and what drove the outcome. Today, we're going to try to focus more on the future. But obviously, in speculating about the future, we'll have to look back a little bit at the past. So I think our speakers will blend some new and some old. Before we begin, I'd just like to introduce our panelists. We have a very good, distinguished panel who can tackle a wide variety of angles with respect to the new administration. So leading off will be Ilyana Kuziemko, professor of economics in the economics department. Her work focuses on public and labor economics, where she specializes in the political economy of inequality in healthcare. Previously, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Treasury for Economic Policy. Our second panelist will be Helen Milner, the BC Forbes Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at Princeton and the Director of the Niehaus Center for Globalization and Governance. She has written extensively on issues related to international and comparative political economy, the connections between domestic politics and foreign policy, globalization and regionalism, and the relationship between democracy and trade policy. In her most recent work, she investigated the source of public and elite preferences for international engagement and the role of the President and Congress in setting foreign policy. That should be useful insight today. And then finally, third, Brandice Canes-Wrone, the Donald E. Stokes Professor of Public and International Affairs, where she serves as the Vice Dean of the Wilson School. She has written extensively on issues related to American politics, political economy, and elections. She has ongoing research projects on the impact of campaign donors on representation, the economic effects of policy uncertainty, and the effects of judicial elections on legal outcomes. I should note that our panel today is being live streamed through the Wilson School's YouTube channel, where you can find a recording of last week's panel, and next week you'll be able to find a recording of this panel. After our discussion, we'll have question and answer period, where you can ask questions using the microphones, or you can submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag #WooLection16, which is the phrase that is up on the screen. So please join me in welcoming our panel, and I look forward to a good discussion.
I think when we first conceived of this panel, I probably made a lot of sense as a panelist. I had worked for a year. Is it on? Okay. I'd worked for a year in the Obama administration. The year that we developed the ACA, I would have friends that would go back. I could have given you some insight on how Hillary is going to tweak the ACA. So I think I made a lot of sense as a panelist. Right now, I'm going to bring you my best guesses. I don't have any particular insight or contacts in the transition team or with the president-elect's staff. So, I'm going to sort of be giving you my best guesses. So the way I thought about domestic policy under Trump and what we might be able to expect is to start with the stuff that seems pretty certain to happen. And by certain, I mean these are positions that Donald Trump has taken that coincide with positions that Paul Ryan has taken and that also are pretty popular. So there's really just no reason that they wouldn't happen. And of course, Brandice, you can correct me. I know you know a lot more about sort of how, motives actually become laws, but this is my best guess. So I think we can start if you're somebody who is on the Democratic side, we can start with some good news, which is that they're both in agreement that Social Security should remain as is. So as of very recently, it's never appeared in Paul Ryan's budget, any changes to Social Security. He recently reaffirmed that on a Fox News interview. And Donald Trump said on the campaign several times, I'm not going to cut Social Security like every other Republican. And I'm not going to cut Medicare or Medicaid. We'll get to the Medicare and Medicaid for a moment, but that's something that I think is sort of off the table. Stuff that I think will be very easy for them to do. They're in agreement, and I don't think there's any popular backlash that's large enough to concern them. Would be a lot of the EPA environmental regulations that were really regulations that were they were passed with a stroke of a pen, and they can be undone with a stroke of a pen. I don't think that's going to be something they hesitate to do. So I think they'll be be a lot easier to drill for natural resources and things like that in the very near future. I also think we're pretty sure to get tax cuts. This is something Donald Trump promised on the campaign. This is something Ryan has talked about for a long time. Tax cuts are popular. Their exact form between a mix of eliminating or lowering the estate tax, lowering marginal tax rates, lowering corporate tax rates, I think will remain to be seen, but that seems to me pretty obvious that we're going to have some tax cuts. And then the last area that I think is pretty clear, and it's not necessarily a domestic policy issue, but maybe more of a foreign policy issue, is border security. It's never been something that Paul Ryan has been all that concerned about, but he has, since the election on interviews, said that border security is a priority, and clearly it was a big part of Donald Trump's Trump's campaign. So where do we get to stuff that seems like it's, a little bit less clear? So infrastructure seems like something that is a little bit less clear. It's never been really part of the Ryan and McConnell agenda, but it was something that, Donald Trump talked a lot about, and that, was in principle quite popular with Democrats. So I think that's a question mark. I think the biggest question mark, and what I'm going to talk about mostly because it's my area of expertise, is on healthcare. So healthcare is a big deal in the US. It's almost 18% of our total GDP. It's a big deal if you're running the government because it's 25% of the federal budget. And it affects states quite a bit because states pay part of Medicaid, which is one of the biggest items on state budgets. So it's about 15% of state budget spending is on Medicaid. And on paper, we should have, on paper being that they both absolutely agree that Obamacare should be repealed. This is something that he said throughout the election. It's something that Paul Ryan has said, throughout his time in Congress, and it was reaffirmed by Mike Pence on Sunday that it's going to be the first thing they do. So decisions have been made by the president-elect that he wants to focus out of the gate on repealing Obamacare and beginning the process of replacing Obamacare with the kind of free market solutions that he campaigned on. From there, we will work on issues ranging from ending illegal immigration, et cetera, et cetera. So I was actually somewhat surprised by that statement. They really are doubling down on repealing Obamacare, especially when it's not clear what it'll be replaced by. Okay, so let's start with what would it be like to replace Obamacare? Let's first start about what Obamacare is. So what did the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, do? It did a lot of things, but the three most important things that it did was expand Medicaid, which has traditionally been the system for very low income children, mothers, and some seniors, expand it to anybody below 138% of the poverty line. So that was a large expansion, and it was not cheap. The second thing that it did was create these exchanges. So this is, private insurance, highly regulated, highly subsidized for people who are too rich for Medicaid, but who don't have other offers of insurance, such as, through their employer, like, most people working at Princeton do. And then there were a lot of regulations about, even if you weren't on Medicaid, even if you weren't on the exchanges, there was regulations about what your health plan had to cover. These were called, essential health benefits. This is where the regulation that all contraceptives for women had to be free, for example, or that all preventive visits had to be free. That was part of the Obamacare legislation as well. How was it paid for? It was paid for with higher taxes. Certainly, Democrats tried not to be so obvious about the fact that there were tax increases, but there certainly were. There was also negotiated cuts to Medicare, specifically hospital payments. So that's essentially what Obamacare did. And how is it doing? Before we repeal it, has it been working out as planned? In some ways it has. The total amount of uninsured in the United States has fallen almost as much as the CBO predicted. So that's kind of been on target. The CBO now estimates that 20 million people are insured who would not have been but for the plan. The exchanges haven't worked out as well as people thought, as well as the CBO, I should say. These are all based on CBO estimates. It's about half the enrollment that the CBO first thought would be picking up people in the exchanges. So enrollment hasn't been what was hoped for. On the other hand, there have been other aspects of the law that's sort of doing better. So overall, the total uninsurance projections haven't been that far off. It's not to say there aren't issues. This sort of depends on, sort of which data you want to cherry pick. There's some saying that, people are kind of happy with their plans. I think there's a general sense, even among Democrats, that things are not on the right trend with the exchanges, that fewer health insurers are offering plans, deductible premiums seem to be increasing. So I don't think there's a sense even among, Democrats that that's not trending in the right direction. So the effects of repeal, if we really are going to repeal Obamacare, are actually well known. The CBO has estimated, basically, it estimated the putting into place Obamacare. They can estimate taking it out, and they think that 19 million people would lose health insurance. And they can repeal it if they want to. The repeal only requires a 50-vote Senate majority. Correct me if I'm wrong. They have the majority in the House, and obviously the president wouldn't veto it, being Donald Trump. So we'll talk about whether they're going to actually do that or not. They've also sort of talked about, Lamar Alexander, certain people have sort of backed off the idea that we're going to repeal right away. But I mean, the statement from Pence yesterday was that it's the first thing on the agenda, and that even replace will be down the road, which I have trouble really thinking that's what they're going to do. But that's what they're talking about. So replace would not be so easy. So there's the idea of repeal and replace. Replace would actually require Democrats to sign on. It would require something that's filibuster-proof. And what do they actually want to replace it with? And this is the big question. So one thing to note is that I can't tell you what the CBO thinks about the replacement plan, because there's never been any plan, even Paul Ryan, who's probably done the most thinking about this, that was specific enough for the CBO to actually do any calculation. So there's just a certain level of specificity that we don't know yet, and no proposal has been specific enough for the CBO to actually do what's called a score. The best we have is sort of an agenda a budget proposal that he fleshed out in 2011, and then his website, this is Paul Ryan, on health reform. But again, this is not specific enough where I could tell you, where anyone could necessarily know if the numbers add up. So I mean, I think I'm taking up a bit too much time, but if questions about what they would do, there are a few things on the table. Again, it's hard to be more specific than that. The last thing I'll talk about is what would happen to existing health plans besides the ACA exchanges. So Medicaid is another big component of the ACA, and repealing Obamacare would be repealing the 11 million people who now have, repealing the insurance for 11 million people who now have insurance through Medicaid exchanges. What's interesting in terms of precedent, one, it would seem to go against Donald Trump's promise to not touch Medicaid. It's also been the case that many Republican governors have adopted the Medicaid expansion. So when push comes to shove, a lot of Republican governors have said, we are going to do the Medicaid expansion. And in particular, states that switch from Democratic to Republican, which is maybe the most, which is the most useful parallel, those governors have not repealed the Medicaid expansion. So it's one thing to say you're going to do it, and it's another thing to actually throw people off insurance. The other interesting thing is that the Medicaid expansion has been adopted by GOP governors in the states that are key to Trump's coalition, so the upper Midwest in particular. And again, these were all done by GOP governors. So I have a little, I'm surprised that there's still the sense that they really are going to repeal that part of Obamacare, given that we haven't seen GOP governors wanting to do that. And I think the big question is what happens with Medicare, because Donald Trump and Paul Ryan are on very different ends of what might happen, what they think should happen to Medicare. Donald Trump has said, I don't want to touch Medicare. And Medicare being the huge portion of federal spending, if you want to have a huge overhaul in the government share of GDP, you have to touch Medicare. And indeed, Paul Ryan wants to touch Medicare. So, essentially, one way of thinking about what Paul Ryan wants to do with Medicare is that he wants to make it look a lot like the Obamacare exchanges. So people would be buying private health insurance. They would have, support from the government to do that. And so it's always been this awkward position, both for the Democrats and the Republicans, that Democrats would criticize Paul Ryan's plan for Medicare, but it actually looks a lot like the plans for Obamacare. So if you really hate Paul Ryan's Medicare plan, you can't necessarily think that the Obamacare exchanges are going to work so well. That's not that's roughly the case. There are differences between how Obamacare exchanges work and how Medicare premium support, Paul Ryan's plan would work. But there's this sort of awkward position that both parties were in, that essentially this model that they criticize, doesn't work in the Medicare context, but does work in the health insurance change context, or if you're a Republican, the reverse, I think is going to just make it, it's very uncertain, which direction they're going to go on Medicare. The other thing I would say is that Medicare is very popular as is. When you do surveys of people's health insurance, the people who are happiest with their insurance are those on Medicare, even relative to plans like employers give you, like we enjoy in Princeton. So the final point to make on that is that those are Donald Trump's voters. The biggest groups who had the biggest Donald Trump-Hillary margin were the elderly and the near elderly. So it'll be very interesting to see how they proceed on Medicare, and that's the area where I think I just have I don't know how Paul Ryan and Donald Trump come together, because their views are quite different on that. Okay, I think those are my best guesses.
Great.
And
thank you. Helen.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about foreign policy. And again, like Ilyana, it's going to be sort of best guesses because we really don't know what the president-elect is going to do. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about what Trump has said will be America's foreign policy when he is president. Then I want to talk about two different views of what it could look like, given that there are two different ways, at least extreme ways, that you could see this working out. So Trump has claimed that he's going to follow this America First foreign policy, which has deep echoes of the 1930s, when the United States pursued a policy marked by isolationism, protectionism, and nationalism. For those of you who remember, that time did not work out so well. We're going to see, I guess, if we can rerun that story. As you know, he has basically said that many of the international trade agreements that the United States is involved with are things that he doesn't agree with. NAFTA, again, I think right after the Affordable Care Act is the next thing on his chopping block. Certainly the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was being negotiated, TTIP, the agreement with the Europeans, and a variety of other things that he's talked about in terms of retaliation against China for currency manipulation, against Mexico for taking our jobs. So on the trade front, he's very much talking about a protectionist type of policy. In more the security areas, as you know, he's threatened our allies with rupturing our alliances, forcing them to pay more for things, not being kind of as secure an ally, and even talking about pushing them to develop and adopt nuclear weapons. He's also then talked about warming up to other countries that we haven't had such warm relations with, including Russia. And right now, Syria with Assad. This seems very much like he will end any kind of democracy promotion efforts that we've undertaken, and probably any human rights promotion efforts that we've undertaken around the globe. In addition, as Ilyana mentioned, immigration policy. This, I think, is the third thing on his chopping block, which is to close borders, build walls, expel people. And stop immigration in many ways. Finally, he's talked about ending the kind of climate change agreements that we've been able to make with other countries, and ending cooperation in many other areas of the environment. So those seem to be kind of the outlines of what he's talked about. Whether he's going to do any of those things, I think, is a totally different question. I did want to just bring up one historical point, though, which I think is interesting. So 29 years ago, pretty much to the day of the election here, Ronald Reagan stood up and said he was going to make America great again. And he stood up in front of the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, and he called on the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, Mikhail Gorbachev, to bring down the Berlin Wall. Now, we have a president who's going to build walls. And 27 years ago, actually on the day of the election, was the day the Berlin Wall fell. So now, we're going to be the ones building walls. So as I said, I think there are two really extreme views of how things could work out, and we'll probably end up somewhere in the middle. But let me sketch out those extremes for you, and then you can sort of place yourself where you want to place yourself on making these bets about how things will turn out. So the first extreme view is that Trump's going to be very constrained. He's talked about all of this. It's all campaign rhetoric. He's going to find out that he's very constrained by domestic politics, by Congress, by public opinion, by the press, and that a lot of this was just talk. It got him the election, but it's really going to go nowhere. And that he, like many other presidents, and if you think back on them, Clinton, Obama, all came into office saying that they were going to renegotiate our trade agreements, that they were going to get our allies to pay more, that they were going to deal with illegal immigration, and a whole variety of issues. And they all basically backtracked on every one of those campaign promises. And so in this view, there's not only domestic constraints on him, that are likely to push him away from many of these things. And I would say one of the biggest is going to be American corporations, because the largest corporations in the United States are heavily, heavily dependent on global trading networks. Something like 50 or 60% of the imports into the United States, that is imports into our country, come from our own firms. They're building things overseas and bringing them back into the United States. You start raising trade barriers, having trade wars, you're basically going to cause a huge recession in the United States as you make all these firms undo all their production processes. And that's going to lead to unemployment, and that's going to lead to a lot of unhappy people in the United States. So he's going to face a lot of pressure, I think, on the domestic front from Congress, from business firms, not to do these kinds of things that he's talking about. There's also the question of abrogating treaties and alliances and international agreements, and he can do many of those things on his own. But again, the question is, once you start down this road, how do you ever convince anybody in the international environment that you're a good partner for anything? And this is the second set of constraints that he may face, which are these external constraints, which is that once you tell the Germans or the French you're not going to protect them anymore, they're going to start taking a series of actions that are probably likely to lead to greater insecurity in the United States itself. And so you're going to start a dynamic that is very, very bad. And one hopes that people will explain this to Trump and his people before they start down this road. Henry Kissinger was just in there talking to him, and hopefully they're trying to explain what kinds of reactions you're going to get from other countries when you start doing these things. The Chinese were already in Peru at the meeting of Pacific economies, talking with every country that we are now telling we're not going to do a trade agreement with, that they want to do a trade agreement with them. Well, I think Trump's going to get annoyed. I think he's thin-skinned enough that he's going to say, what are those Chinese doing? Why are they doing this? And if they're doing this, shouldn't we be doing this? So I think he's going to have a lot of pressure from external constraints and internal constraints to return to what we would call a normal sort of foreign policy that pushes him very far away from any of these America First types of policies. So that's one view, which some mornings I wake up very optimistic about and think that all my research points to a lot of these constraints and he's going to be constrained. Then the next day I wake up and I say to myself, oh my goodness, he may not be constrained at all. Domestically, we are now in a single-party government situation. The Senate, the House, most state houses, governorships, the presidency, all Republicans all the time. There just aren't any constraints. And sure, there may be some mild differences of opinion, but it's not clear to me that any one of those branches is really going to try and stop Trump from doing the things that he wants to do in foreign policy. So there may not be any domestic constraints on him. As for external constraints, the U.S. is a superpower. It's the strongest country in the world in almost every dimension. If we get into trade wars with other countries, it's going to hurt us, but it's probably going to hurt them more. So we can suffer through these things, and other people are going to suffer more. So at some level, the United States is sort of gifted to have this superpower position. And it can do a lot without many external constraints on it. And this is the other side that I wake up to, and I basically say, if he wants to do these things, if he wants to basically end trade ties, if he wants to end the climate agreements, if he wants to build a wall and stop immigration, if he wants to sort of change our alliance partners and basically get rid of NATO and our Western allies, I mean, he can go down a road that starts doing these things and that starts generating enormous insecurity in the system. Imagine what the world is like. You don't have NATO. You have fewer, no troops in Europe. You've got the Russians wondering what's going to happen. You've got Germany thinking about developing nuclear weapons. You've got the Japanese thinking about developing nuclear weapons, the South Koreans. You're going to have a very dangerous and insecure world. And again, this will probably then come back to haunt the United States, because we know that in times of great external danger, democracy is always threatened. And so the worry is that you get this enormous foreign kind of reaction, and you get a real sort of problem with domestic civil liberties in the United States as a reaction. So I go back and forth between those two extremes every morning, and I don't really know where we're going to end up. I have a feeling it's somewhere in the middle of those two places, but I would sure hope it's in the former, but I wouldn't put a lot of money on that.
Thank you. Brandice.
Okay, so I was delegated everything else on policy, so I'm going to have a little more breadth and maybe a little less depth on some of them. But Helen is a nice lead-in. I sort of think about the Trump presidency, and one of the interesting aspects an important aspect is how much will Washington shape Trump versus how much will he reshape Washington. I haven't been that heartened over the past weekend. Well, it was entertaining to see his Twitter response to the Hamilton episode where the actors were talking to Mike Pence, and then Trump wrote that he thought Hamilton was highly overrated. You know, there's this part of me that, well, but he's really not a reality TV star anymore. He's actually the president. So you'd hope that he would react a little more like Pence, who commented that that's the sound of freedom talking when you heard boos for him. So Trump seems to not have fully shifted from the reality TV role and is maybe taking on a reality Twitter role into the presidency. And if that's all he's going to do in the presidency and we like his appointments, there's some, I guess, upside, one could say. But, he is the president, and so we think it will go beyond style. I think that despite the unusual style that seems like it's here to stay, for better or worse, and I think some of us would certainly say for worse, it does remain to be seen how much Trump will reshape the Republican and the agenda. And by reshaping the Republican agenda, of course, that has implications for the types of policies and coalitions that each party will take on. And so it has potentially longer lasting implications. I tend to think of the policies as a political scientist would, and Ilyana referred to some of the unilateral powers, that there are these issues that Trump can largely affect unilaterally, and then there are ones on which he'll need congressional approval. And that will have a large impact on which ones ultimately are the ones where he reshapes Washington, at least temporarily, and the world, versus it reshaping him. So as Helen mentioned, Trump comes to office with a foreign policy agenda. I'll put what you might say is a more positive spin, though I'm guessing at your views here, I think intelligently, but you can tell me I'm wrong. He does contrast starkly with the neocons. This does not seem to be someone that Bill Kristol is cheering on at the Weekly Standard. Trump wants to not overextend America in the foreign policy domain. Of course, this isn't with a lot of experience and nuance. And then he also, as you point out, Helen wants to pull us back from more globalist economic policies. And he has a lot of authority to do that. On domestic policy, if you take Trump at his word, he has indicated a much more centrist and at times, and I say this with the support of people like Bernie Sanders, sometimes a more left-leaning position on some issues. Ilyana pointed out, he's stated he doesn't want to change Medicare or Social Security. He wants to invest in infrastructure. I think that Bernie Sanders is correct that he and Trump on policies, of course, these are policies like bringing American companies home and possibly causing some economic havoc in the process and maybe not bringing them home, but on which they'll have some agreement. And I don't think that that's so far reaching. Which Donald Trump will emerge? We could have a presidency then that could look on some issues at least much more moderate than someone like George W. Bush, but on other issues, very far to the right. The issues on which I think we'll see him enact these kind of unilateral policies tend to be in the foreign domain and then these kind of bridge areas like immigration and trade policies. So as Helen mentioned, but I'll state a little more detail, Congress over time has given the president a great deal of authority to undo trade agreements. So even though Congress has in many cases agreed to them, so with NAFTA, there's an article that allows the president to give 6 months notice, and Trump has cited this article to Mexico and Canada
that we're taking ourselves out of the agreement. Trump has claimed he's going to do it. I don't necessarily think he'll do that, but I think he'll threaten to do it, and that it's going to be very difficult for him politically not to extract some sort of changes that relate to U.S. and Mexico trade after all he said, and merely the fact that the president can do it. On other trade agreements, Trump has large latitude to claim that the other countries are not are causing harm to American security, are causing harm to our trade deficit, aren't playing fairly by the terms of the agreement, and can extract, unilaterally move America away from those agreements. And even though they were congressionally approved, Trump does not need congressional approval to make those claims and take us out of them. So I think it's very unlikely after saying this and after carrying Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan, he's going to do absolutely nothing on trade. Having said that, even fairly pro-free trade presidents like George W. Bush did make concessions and enacted protectionist policies, for instance, on steel to try to get Pennsylvania. So whether these protectionist policies will take us into a full-scale trade war, I think remains to be seen. And I expect that Trump will try to do a shift very quickly from this sort of very hardcore protectionist policy into talk of fair trade, which is what most politicians that are supporting protectionist policies do. So I think that we'll end up seeing, as you indicated, something in the middle on these policies. But it's hard to see how politically he can do nothing. That's the central issue. He led his first debate on the trade issue, actually, not on immigration. It's the issue that animates many people in the swing states he carries. These are areas where, technology has had large effects. But if you're living in one of those towns, I happen to be, for other reasons, in Reading. I've been in Scranton recently. If you're living in one of those towns and you've watched these factories leave, it's just a very different world for you. Some of them have left due to technology, but some of them have left and are importing, as you pointed out, the products that are produced elsewhere back to America. And they're very different towns as a result of this. So I'm a pro-free trade academic, like most academics, but when you visit these towns, you do see a different world, and you understand where these votes are coming from. I mentioned that one of my colleagues, since I didn't warn him that I'd mention him by name, I won't, but one of my colleagues who works very strongly on climate change, it's a very optimistic view on the environment. I do not share that view as a political scientist, although I'm not an environmental activist, so I am happy to be shown to be wrong. It seems that Trump has made many statements that are kind of consistent with the same coalition, that he intends to roll back environmental regulations, that he tends to be very pro-U.S. energy exploration, and he has the unilateral authority in these areas to do it. He's said he's pro-coal. I don't know how he kind of gets these votes, and then with the unilateral authority, doesn't move ahead. He also comes in on some other policies and unilaterally pulls back, of course, some of Obama's executive orders. Some of Obama's most expansive ones are already being challenged in the courts. So the ones on the EPA and climate change are in the appellate. I checked this morning to make sure there's no ruling from the appellate courts, but any day now we'll get that ruling. It'll be appealed, whatever it is. It'll go to the Supreme Court, and it'll probably be overturned there anyways, given Trump's ability to tilt the balance and sort of see the fate that Obama's immigration reforms did. But that's kind of a real day one behavior, that all of Obama's executive actions come through. As a kind of related note, but a side note on this, one of the concerns that many academics have is that Trump will basically move the executive into a much more authoritarian regime. This has been a bit of whiplash. For years, academics who have liked Obama's moves to more executive power have been cheering him on. Now we're hearing a lot of concern about executive power. Someplace like the Cato Institute has been relatively consistent in these concerns. I share, particularly given Trump's proclivity for going on Twitter and calling out journalists, I share all of these concerns. At the same time, as a political scientist, we do see the the typical progression is that each president builds on each other. So I certainly expect that just as Obama built on George W. Bush and George W. Bush built on his predecessors, Trump will try to build, but the courts and Congress will try to restrain. And we have seen, just as in the 1970s, that when presidents tend to go too far, then there does tend to be this congressional backlash. And Trump does face a Republican Congress, so on many issues, there'll be some agreement, but as Ilyana and Helen have pointed out, this is not a Republican Congress where even all of them supported Trump, and many of them did so only so that they themselves could get reelected. So this is a Congress that's not going to want to hand too much executive power over to Trump, let alone to future presidents. Having said that there are these policies on which he'll act relatively unilaterally, I think there are a lot on which he'll work with Congress and will largely cede some influence to Paul Ryan. And so I think one of the reasons that the ACA is so high up on the agenda, even though it wasn't really essential to Trump's campaign as immigration and trade, is that the Republicans have passed these kind of 50 repeal, what is it, 50 some, maybe you know that. It's just this huge dozens and dozens of repeal bills. So I mean, what are the, they just look ridiculous if they don't do something. But you can see that Trump himself is using the words repeal and replace. He's already talked about keeping the pre-existing condition stipulation. I don't know that he'll be able to get that out of the Republican Congress, but I think that's that in some ways is a very big part of Obamacare, at least to much of the public. I realize it's not the to the economists, it's not the exchanges.
It was unclear how it works without the other parts.
Yeah. But it's a very big part of it to many Americans. Trump also plans to keep the insurance for 22 to 26-year-olds for college students. So quickly, what's been repeal is moving quickly into repeal and replace. And although there are these moments where, if you've seen the producers' take on Trump, where it looks like he's doing everything to try to fail at the campaign, but he's doing better and better. I mean, there's certainly moments where I felt like, yeah, it's just incredible. But there are moments where you see the intelligence, and he seems to understand that voters like certain policies, like the pre-existing condition policy, like Medicare, like Social Security. And so then he does start to sound like the populist that he is. So I think that other than these kind of very popular policies, though, he'll cede a lot to Ryan, and we'll get the tax cuts that Ryan wants. We'll get some of the other healthcare changes that Ryan and the Republicans want. They've got, they've been promising it. They're going to have to do something. And so we'll see this division, which is going to be in part based on Trump's own priorities, but it's just in part based on the structural condition that we've had. So this is some people were asking me, do we have anything optimistic to say? And I mean, this of course depends in part on your policy views, but I think that there really are issues on which Trump will be far less kind of extreme than people think. That his own positions are not that extreme. He has a veto power, and that he's seems to be the sort of person who isn't going to be that inconvenienced by the presidency. He may still live in the Trump Tower. He may,
Today he announced he was going to move to the White House.
Oh, he is moving to the White House. Just
but
Melania
and
and Byron are not going to move. Okay, so he's not going to let it. He's still going to spend time in Palm Beach, though, and
right.
Golf course, so he may actually want a second term. He's, in that sense, going to cater to the same voters who elected him, and that in and of itself is going to provide, at least on the domestic front, some real constraints.
Terrific. Thank you. Okay. Now, as I said, we'd like to open it up for questions. There's two mechanisms for asking a question. One is to line up behind the microphones, and the other is to tweet using the hashtag WooLection16. Okay. So we'll start with a question from Twitter. And I think this is probably directed mostly to Ilyana. The question is, will Trump seek to change the law to let Medicare negotiate prices for drugs and devices much as the VA can do now?
I think he's been, I have no idea what he's really going to do. I mean, I think he has been, so for example, the best example on sort of how he is a work in progress on this question. So he had originally said that he would allow foreign importation of drugs, which is, sort of, again, allowing Medicare to have a bit more bargaining power by looking overseas for some prices. And Paul Ryan's against that, so actually that disappeared from his website. So I don't know. I would guess not, but I think it's one of these things where he might have said one thing during the campaign, but now that the rubber hits the road, he's more on the sort of Republican, on sort of the Paul Ryan side on that.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. This is a very interesting discussion. I have a couple of questions about the infrastructure. One is the wall. We have a wall, 700 miles, but there are places where we can't have the wall, and where we have the wall, we have tunnels, and people shoot their drugs over the wall. So the wall is a fiction. We can't have a wall going straight through an Indian reservation or on the side of the river, the Rio Grande. It's completely idiotic. Okay, then the question I have about the infrastructure, the $1 trillion, $500 million infrastructure, how's that going to work? Where's that money going to come from? Is that in the budget? Who's going to execute that? Is it going to be a tax deal with people that who see him as his protector?
Okay, terrific. Okay. Somebody like to?
So I looked up on the immigration part of it, where Trump put E-Verify in his list of policies. So it's going to be very hard to cut down, as you point on immigration, if there are jobs. So I mean, that's what determines immigration flows in the United States, the economy in the United States, and how many job opportunities there are. So you can put up a wall, people can come over and, trucks, planes, they can stay on, tourist visas, or they can be smuggled in different ways. So the wall is a wall. E-Verify ranked 8th or 9th on Trump's immigration priorities. I take that to mean that, he's going to do some symbolic things on immigration, and I think there will be some movement, but that it's not going to be the extreme movement that he kind of talked about.
And it's another issue that sort of splits his coalition, or splits not his coalition,
Right.
but splits the Republicans,
Right.
where the Chamber of Commerce position would be to want to have cheap labor, and certainly many sort of the business Republicans would be a little suspicious of controlling the supply of unskilled labor.
On the infrastructure question, his current plan mostly involves tax credits. And so when you hear the $1 trillion price tag, that includes the amount of private capital that's supposed to be induced by the tax credits. But my understanding is that it's not quite clear that you can get there with tax credits. Many of the things that we need in this country to be built are things that private investors are not interested in funding. So in response to that, Chuck Schumer, who's taking over as the minority leader of the Senate, says we need a real infrastructure bill where there's $1 trillion of actual spending. So I think the divisions between the parties on this is they're both going to be saying $1 trillion worth of infrastructure, but part of it is an expectation of private funding and the other part of it is government funding. Both of those proposals will split the Trump coalition pretty significantly. Yeah. Right. Yes.
If the new administration backs off of the climate issues, it's been suggested that other countries might retaliate, for example, by assessing a carbon tax on any American exports. What does the panel think the effects of such actions might be?
I mean, I guess I think the Europeans have been the major ones threatening to do that. And again, American corporations, I think, are going to be, especially the largest corporations, are going to be sort of horrified by all of this. As with the immigration, a lot of the immigration stuff, E-Verify, they're sort of very opposed to many of these things. So again, he's going to have these pressures, and as a businessman, he may well be listening to some of these corporations. He's again going to be split, as Nolan and Brandice have said. He's got the voters that supported him are not sort of in favor of big business and multinational corporations and trade, and so he's going to be pushed and pulled in many different directions.
Great.
Yeah, there's a long history of environmental agreements that are just not implemented very strongly. So he's going to have, there's a difference between pulling out of agreements and simply, okay, maybe we'll make the target, who knows, activity. But there are domestic regulations that he can pull back quickly. He has said he'll leave the Paris Agreement, so I know he said that, but he says a lot of things he comes back, that he then doesn't do. So I would be more fearful that he wouldn't implement it sincerely.
With regard to the coal industry, are there businesses or enterprises that are willing to invest in the coal industry still in the United States today?
Well, there's still coal mining in the United States. It hasn't, so, I think it gets into which types of regulations. So I think the short answer is yes. There are coal businesses that exist in the United States, and then there are regulations that can make that more or less profitable.
But they've been taking coal plants out of operation in a very steady pace, and they've been replacing any new coal plants with very heavy capital-intensive plants using machines and robots rather than humans. So you're never going to have the kind of employment in coal that you did before. So even if you start new investments, it's going to be a very different scale of employment opportunities. You're going to be hiring programmers and things like this, high-skilled people more than people digging holes and things.
And some of the decline in coal is through natural gas being cheaper. So
it is, and
that's
some
kind of unrelated to anything Trump can do anything about.
Actually, one of Trump's...
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. One of his promises is to deregulate the process of new pipelines.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
So he'll make natural gas even cheaper.
And
we could actually undermine coal
nothing that would bring back coal.
To enable more fracking, to enable. It's not going to bring back coal, but I think that the process has been to increase the cost of both East Coast and West Coast coal as well. And so no, you're not going to bring back the jobs from the Loretta Lynn day, and I don't think we'd want to do that for a variety of reasons. But again, in those towns, having some industry there is better than no industry.
Sure. Let's take a question from Twitter. Given the issues where Trump is to the left of the Democrats, will this be a trigger for the realignment of our politics?
Oh, that's a great question. He's not to the left. He's left of some Republicans. I wouldn't say there's many issues on which he's to the left of anything, but maybe like the Wall Street wing of the Democrats. I think we went into this election over the summer, thinking as academics, it'll be so interesting to see how the Republicans realign because this is going to destroy them. And of course, we're left with the Democrats suddenly feeling like they have soul searching to do. How will this, the realignment of the parties is obviously very hard to predict. I do think that the Democrats, certainly all the talk and all the soul searching is to have a more sort of economically populist message for working class voters. And I would think that's the direction the Democratic Party goes in. So I'm not sure this is a realignment or just going, truly a realignment is sort of going back to the Democrats' roots, which, really were working class both white and minority, and sort of having that be the focus. The Obama coalition of sort of minorities sort of as minorities and then well-educated white coastal elites, I think is something we're not going to hear a lot about. I think the Democrats think that was something that they relied too much on.
Well, I think on issues like the trade and then even it's always complicated with foreign policy because the parties always seem to go switch. But on trade, I would say that Trump was to the left, traditionally what we'd think of a left to at least Hillary Clinton as someone who was involved with NAFTA.
No, that's true.
And so I think there are some issues. And then I see this sort of Republicans, it's almost Helen, you can correct me, you're the IR scholar, but a return to the realism of earlier times in the Republican Party. I don't know that that's really, it was sort of strange that the Republicans became the party of sort of democracy, strange historically, of democracy promotion and humanitarian, a kind of globalist humanitarian position, but now Trump seems to be bringing it back.
I mean, I think Trump is actually going to be pretty militaristic. I mean, I watch the people he's appointing. They're all military backgrounds. He's never had the military instrument in his hand before. He's been a business person. When he gets that in his hand, he's going to see how, in some ways, powerful it is to talk about it. And I think he's going to find it's very difficult in these other areas, in trade and immigration, to really get things done. And he's going to start resorting to the military side. And I think he's bringing in a group of people who want to go to war with Iran. And I would not be surprised if in 2 years we're at war with Iran.
Oh, my. So, but now, so I'm not going to disagree with that prediction.
I would not be surprised.
Do you think that militaristic people usually want to go to war? Or do you think the military, people with a military background want to go to war?
The people he's bringing in seem to, right? I mean, they're on, I mean, the fact that he's thinking about Rudy Giuliani and he's on
Well, Giuliani, I don't think, yeah, so that's
no,
militaristic,
but that is sort of
but not
giving you
military.
some sense of like people he feels comfortable with, even if he's not.
I mean, I think he knows so little right now about all of this stuff, and he's appointing all these people who have got deep, deep military experience, who really dislike, Islam and all of this, and are really opposed to the Iranian agreement and see Iran as kind of really, really bad. It just would not surprise me at all if there's a whole series of things that go on that gets him involved militarily with Iran.
Okay. Next question. Stan.
I'm wondering whether you can give us a little bit of hope. And my question is really, if you were a committee advising Senator Schumer, what areas would you point him to as possible areas where some common cause could be made on things that those who supported Hillary Clinton might want to emphasize?
I mean, I think the most obvious.
Sure.
I'm sorry, not close enough. I was just asking whether there are areas that Senator Schumer could work on to build agreement with the Republicans on particular issues that are of interest to core Democratic concerns.
So the question was, in case you still couldn't hear it, was can Schumer and Trump find areas that Democrats wouldn't, be happy with? I mean, the most obvious example is infrastructure. I think that infrastructure funded by deficit spending is something that's popular, something Democrats, I think the case for that is not as strong, given that the economy's gotten stronger, and the case for that kind of stimulus is strongest when the economy's weak. But, I think there's also a view among Democrats, I think it's very split about whether the best thing is just absolute gridlock to the extent that they can and never give Trump a big bipartisan win. I mean, if Trump really, had a bipartisan infrastructure bill, that would be a huge coup, I think. And I think there are Democrats who are worried that anything that strengthens Trump is not just politically for them, but also in terms of, if world security, that, every minute he's in office is a risk. So it depends on, I think Democrats are really split. And certainly if you read sort of, Democratic-leaning publications, this question of should they compromise on infrastructure being that example seems split 50-50.
Yes.
What do you think Trump's position will be with regard to Israel and the two-party solution and peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
I mean, he's said that on day one he's going to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which is just bound to have really, really angering effects with the Palestinians and with a lot of the other governments in the Middle East. And again, this is a fairly symbolic thing that he can do, and he may well do it. He may get talked out of it. Again, it depends on sort of how strong these constraints are on him. I think he's going to have a lot of trouble in the Middle East. Again, I think that he may align with parts of the government in Israel that really wants to take on Iran, and try and will the Saudis then push him to do even more in that front, and will we get a whole sort of movement going like we did with Iraq again? I don't know, but I don't see much prospect for the two-state solution. I mean, my sense is that even in Israel, there's not much support for it, and I don't hear Trump talking about it either. So.
Okay, great. From Twitter, how do you foresee the Trump presidency affecting the credibility and independence of the media and academia?
Oh, wow.
I think he just had them all in to scold them, right? Didn't he have them today all into his office to scold them? Yeah, and to come to some understanding about things. So, I worry very, very much about this. There's been a move around the world toward what's called sort of illiberal democracy, where you have elections and you supposedly have competition in elections, but you've got fewer and fewer civil liberties, less and less freedom of the press, more and more pressure and censorship on anybody who disagrees with the government. And these are the people that Trump has come out and says he really admires and wants to be like the Sisis, the Erdogans, the Putin's. I mean, it's Orban. I mean, it's across the board that you're seeing this. And so if that's what he really wants, and he clearly doesn't like the press when it disagrees with him, so I think there's very grave threats to the press and to our civil liberties.
This is where people, on the right and the left, sort of on the more extremes, seem really prescient. Like someone like Glenn Greenwald, who was like, no, Democrats find him annoying because he's, further to the left, but warning about, the ability of the government to spy on people. I mean, you could imagine, we're like, oh, well, it's okay because Obama had that power, but now that Trump might have that power, and thinking about enemies in the press, academia, that seems very prescient, whether it's Cato on the right or Glenn Greenwald on the left.
And I mean, the one thing that these sort of leaders do is that they dismantle the opposition party. And I think the Democratic Party is in real danger right now. And I think that Trump would have the ability over the course of 4 years to do a lot of things that really hinder the Democrats if he wants to. And so I think that is a very worrisome thing in addition.
So I'm going to interpret the question a little differently. So, you could interpret it as Trump the president is going to cause a lack of independence. But you could also interpret the question, since the questioner isn't here, that sort of the way in which the media or the mainstream media and academics have treated Trump is, there's a kind of question about our independence. So I went through all 5 stages of brief about Trump in the spring. As an election scholar, I'm very well aware that general elections are often determined by the broad kind of conditions, and that despite the way the media tends to cover general elections, that the individual personalities matter a lot less. So even though I can't say I predicted the Trump winning, I always knew it was very possible. So I was, in that sense, more emotionally, the depression happened in April. But I take seriously this idea that we have to try to give him a chance, and that despite the fact that I think he's temperamentally unsuited for the office and is carrying on somewhat of a reality TV show, that as academics, if we sort of don't treat him somewhat seriously, we are ourselves undermining our own independence and credibility. And so I fear all the things you've said, Helen, but I think we have to be open to the possibility that he'll govern, and then wait and pounce when we see that not happening. And it just seems to me that the Democratic Party, so far, it has not been due to Trump directly. It's been due to the Democrats' own behavior and sort of overconfidence and lack of, thinking through the disaffected nature of some of their voters. So I sort of see us as having to uphold our kind of independence in evaluating him as it progresses.
Yes.
The bulk of my questions could be about the media, so thank you for jumping ahead. But the other part that was connected to it is his secretiveness and obviously his disdain for having to reveal anything that's important to him, with the taxes, with his businesses, meeting with India, the towers. Is any of that going to be forced? He's not legally forced to do any of that. Is there going to be any pressure that's going to make him behave in a clear manner?
I mean, so Congress could in the future pass a law saying that every president has to, it's not like the constitutional thing, that could be.
Yeah, the president would have to sign it, but they could overturn the veto.
The decision to exempt the president from
Yeah.
conflict of interest laws is a congressional decision.
Yeah.
It's not a constitutional decision.
Yeah.
But interestingly, in terms of the politics, if his popularity were to decline, and Democrats repeatedly asked for hearings related to his conflicts of interest, I think it would be difficult politically not to hold them. And then you get in a situation where some wobbly Republicans start to say, well, we need to do something about this. So I do think it's a very concerning matter, and I do think that people who are concerned about it should continue to press the issue, because I wouldn't say nothing can be done about it simply because the Republicans hold majorities. I think a lot can be done to highlight those issues and to keep them on the public agenda.
And sort of a related issue is that there are still a lot of civil lawsuits pending against him from the women who have accused him of sexual harassment, sexual assault, and the Supreme Court has determined under the Clinton administration that president is not immune from civil suits. So there's, I think, going to be that going on in the background as well. So I think he'll be the subject of civil lawsuits throughout his administration.
And the untangling of his children, will that be dealt with, or does that just kind of keep sliding?
I'm guessing.
I think that's what Congress, Democrats in Congress should insist upon investigating and holding hearings and formulating policy proposals than trying to force Republicans to take those seriously. Yes.
It seems to me we haven't talked very much so far about what happens to the social fabric of this country, particularly with the appointment of people like Bannon and Flynn and Sessions, and the notion of a kind of white supremacist revenge against the ethnic coalitions of the Obama era and going back well before that. So I wonder what the panelists think about that.
I think that the appointment so far, I think it's a real dilemma for people who are, questioning, sort of giving Trump a chance. I think the appointments have made that hard for a lot of people. On the one hand, there is a tradition of letting the president choose his team. And so, some of these are not even Senate confirmed. So there's literally nothing that the opposition could do if he wants to hire a chief of staff. That's not something that the Senate confirms, right? The appointments, I think, is a really interesting question in terms of whether the Democrats give him, you're allowed to pick your own cabinet, we're not going to hold them up in hearings, or that certain people are beyond the pale. Some people might say that about Jeff Sessions. So I'm not really answering your question, but I think that the appointments are sort of the first test of whether Democrats are going to take the view that he has the right to govern, or that this is some kind of slippery slope to something that could be much worse, and so we have to fight even something that in a normal time we would let the president pick his own team.
Yeah, I see two components. There's the campaign itself, particularly in the primaries, although also somewhat during the general, where the demagogic way in which Trump won, I think, is very disturbing. Although, unfortunately, not unprecedented in our history, but kind of unprecedented in the time of modern mass communications, but kind of harks back to the types of campaigns we saw in the 1830s, right? So, and I think it's very worrisome because other politicians will learn from, what worked. And so I worry a lot about that in terms of our social fabric. I think when you look at some of the cabinet picks, of course, it's early to know. But so, for instance, for HHS, he's been talking to, there is a kind of broader racial and gender dynamic in the people he's talking to for a variety of the cabinet positions. Now, some people might say, oh, but that person, they may be African-American, but they worked for Paul Ryan. But that's not really fair in my mind. If we're worried about a broad racial and, Kellyanne Conway, she might get something, but, she's really conservative and she worked for Ted Cruz. But those are sort of, he's going to pick people who, fit with the sort of different types of Republican policies, or in some cases, his policies, even if the person's a Democrat. So I worry a lot less at this point, given who he's taking in to interview, but I worry a lot about the sort of demagogic nature of his comments, even if it's Kellyanne Conway who's coming on to excuse the comments after the fact.
Thank you. Yes.
It seems like in the aftermath of this election, concerns of the middle class people are taking them much more seriously, and and I think even most people would say that even with if the coal and the oil industry are given a chance, they're not going to see the growth that was kind of promised, and especially just with like the Midwestern swing states. What do you think are things that Democrats could do to get that vote back with more kind of realistic aims?
So let me take that because I grew up in one of the places that has been receiving a ton of attention, Macomb County, Michigan, which like MSNBC spent the whole week there this week, because it's a county that's famous in political science because it was where the term Reagan Democrat was coined. So these are a bunch of people who, like, it's a working class suburb. Everybody there sort of economically should be a Democrat, and yet, it went for Reagan. And then it went for Obama twice. And then it went for Trump. So, I mean, I think there's a potentially easy answer for Democrats. And so they went and talked to people in Macomb County, and they said, well, why did you switch from, you voted for Obama twice, why did you switch to Trump? And some people said that, well, Trump showed up and he did events here. And the Democrats had taken Macomb County and Michigan more generally for granted. And so that's a really easy answer to some extent. We just need to show up. I will also say that Macomb County and Michigan more generally was probably the biggest upset. According to Nate Silver, Michigan was the biggest upset in the primary in terms of what the polls thought and what actually happened. Bernie Sanders won Michigan against Hillary in the primaries. And I think his message really did resonate, and his message was not race baiting. It was not some sense that the Democrats, I should say, had to, get rid of identity politics or, have a broad multicultural coalition. But, he did pillory Wall Street. He did, say that trade agreements had to, consider people who would be losers from these trade agreements. So I tend to think that, Bernie, maybe not everything about his message, but something about what Bernie said, which was not race baiting in any way. And so I don't feel like you need to win the upper Midwest by saying mean things about minorities. But I do think the Democrats have taken it for granted. And so maybe that would, that's sort of the Democrats' way forward.
I mean, I think there's a much bigger problem, though. I mean, it's not trade, it's technology. And no matter who was president, you're going to be facing this problem in the United States with, what is it now, 75% of the voting population doesn't have a college degree, where you have a total mismatch for the kind of jobs that are coming, which are going to require much more kind of training. And so I think that Trump is going to have a very hard time. Even if he goes protectionist, there aren't going to be tons and tons of jobs that are popping up for these things, because when you start a new factory for these things, it's a lot cheaper to have a machine that can run 24 hours a day, that doesn't join a union, that doesn't need health care.
But in fairness, the Democrats don't have an answer to that either, right?
Yes,
So,
I agree. I mean,
um,
there's this universal basic income idea, but then I hear again, sort of a lot of these middle-class voters don't want any kind of government handout. They want a job,
Right.
and one can understand that very, very well, but it's a real problem for the once industrial countries right now, because unless you try and stop technological change, you're going to have a very strong mismatch between skills and future jobs.
But I mean, in the past, we've had this in the past too. Electrification, and the way we responded historically was the high school movement. It was very expensive and it wasn't necessarily popular everywhere, but and it was more local. But there was a sense that people did need more education, and I think. If you, again, sort of think like, we need to think about free university in the same way that we have free high school. I'm not, the numbers would need to be worked out, but at least that's an idea.
No, I think that an interesting point. So I thought for this talk about because some of his major executive orders have involved student loan and it's not quite student loan forgiveness, but forgiveness after this many repayments, sort of, things that the Weekly Standard would call forgiveness.
Right.
And I'm not sure Obama will rescind, I mean, not Obama, Trump will rescind those. And I was trying to think about this. Will he he hasn't, as far as I know, said he plans to rescind those. And it's, it's going to be hard to improve those areas without doing things about the education
But that's a slow fix.
system.
I mean,
It's a
even
very
if-
slow fix.
And so, I mean, in the meantime,
But-
I don't think it's crazy to think about things like government employment, and even things that we might sort of think about as make work. I mean, we do need to think out of the box. And as an economist, I feel like I'm losing my economist card saying that. But
Well, I mean, I think you've got to get a lot of people into colleges of some sort, and you've got to get them sort of more training and more education, and you've got to move them up as fast as you kind of can. But then in the meantime, again, you're dealing with 40 and 50-year-olds and things like that who are losing these jobs for a variety of things. And for them, I just don't know if retraining is going to be the way to go. But you're going to have to do something, because I just don't think Trump's fixes are going to fix anything because of these problems.
I would also say I don't think the Democrats have an answer either.
Right. Oh, yes, I defer to the President Emeritus.
I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet, but what possible Supreme Court decisions do you see coming down in the next 2 or 3 years? Or is it too depressing to even think about?
Brandice, it's you, I think.
Okay. I mean, I think an interesting question at first is sort of who will he bring in?
He has a list, right?
He has yes, he had a list during the campaign.
Yeah.
That was one of the kind of like the meeting.
Concessions
I thought it was also one of the moves to make him try to seem more presidential in the campaign. I have my list. This is where I'm sorry that I'm going to probably depress you now, but I think, we haven't talked a lot.
It's impossible.
Okay. We haven't talked a lot about social issues. I don't think anyone believes that Trump is personally all that conservative socially, since he spent much of his, not just youth, but adulthood as a playboy in New York City. But this is one on which it's going to be very hard for him not to, how does he satisfy the kind of religious right? Well, he's not going to get a lot through legislation. I don't think he's going to enact executive orders, but he's going to have to. I don't think he'll necessarily look to, he's said explicitly already that he's not looking to undo gay marriage. So it doesn't seem he's been upfront about that, so I don't think he's going to try to pull back on that, but he's going to have to appoint a conservative
But don't you
justice.
think
a very conservative justice, and one that the far right, maybe within the bounds of not undoing that sort of decision, will accept.
But don't you feel like if he's also committed to having pro-life justices, and I feel like those positions are so.
Yeah,
he's
been.
The pro-life justice might just be somebody who's also going to
be
happy to overturn.
I didn't want to depress Shirley more because he said that he is open to overturning Roe v. Wade. So
But I mean, that's a promise, and interestingly, it's also part of the base, like the group that everyone thought, they might not turn out for him, but they really did. Were evangelical Christians.
Yeah, no, and they're gonna.
So I think that he owes them quite a bit.
I mean, he does. The Republicans do have this history, like with Roberts, of people who kind of look more conservative, and then they're in, and they're a little more. But I think you have right to be worried.
The one silver lining is that when a new Supreme Court's nominated and confirmed, will return to the court prior to the Scalia death, and so there are lots of things on that list returned with